Hey guys, so I sat down to watch the Jubilee debate between Piers Morgan and 20 woke liberals, and I actually really appreciated this debate. So it took me a while to get into it, and I was really mentally scattered, and so I ended up crocheting and then just having it play in the background, and that was the best way for me to watch it. There were a lot of funny moments that I definitely appreciated, and I'm excited to talk about in this video, but just to give my general vibes of this debate, I really appreciated the way that they were able to have lighthearted moments and have funny moments, but then also really debate respectfully. Piers, he would stand up and shake everyone's hands. He would shake their hands when they were done debating. So it was a really nice and pleasant conversation, even though there were some heated moments during the discussion. Now, I did look at the comment section, and a lot of people are talking about how Piers is going to be interrupting people, how Parker is going to be annoying, and other people are talking about how Piers is going to be, well, hang on a minute, hang on there, right? And so I can't do his accent, but you did see him doing that. He was interrupting people, and so this was basically a wilder version, kind of uncensored, because you had so many more people involved in the conversation. Normally it's just like 4 or 5 people at a time. You can't hear who's talking because they're constantly talking over each other. So this was a little bit better in terms of format, but it was basically just like uncensored. And I do appreciate watching it, but it's not my go-to, if that makes sense. And so anyway, really happy to see Piers Morgan debating and talking about his ideas, and then having other people challenge Piers Morgan. Okay, so let's get into the first claim. So masculinity is never toxic. Piers Morgan took the approach that toxic masculinity is not a thing. He said that we already have a word for that, and that is misogyny. So basically what he's speaking to is men who embody the bad traits of being a man and who are kind of hostile or negative towards women, or they don't think highly of women. They don't appreciate women the way they should. So that's kind of what he's getting into, and what I think people are talking about when they talk about toxic masculinity. They are talking about men embodying like the worst traits of being a man. They also argue that toxic femininity was a thing, so basically embodying the worst traits of what it means to be a woman. And I don't necessarily know if I think that these two things should exist, like toxic femininity and toxic masculinity, because I know that different genders can have different levels of masculine energy and feminine energy. So you can have a woman who has more masculine energy than feminine energy. Would you refer to her as having toxic masculinity? Not really, because she's a woman. And so that's why I think those labels are a little bit misleading, because you just have people behaving poorly, and it's not always tied to their gender or their sex. And I'm going to say it's not tied to their sex because I know that gender is something that they discuss later on, and I don't want to confuse anybody in this portion of the video. The other thing they talked about was stoicism, and basically just the idea of not focusing on things that you can't control, regulating your emotions, that sort of thing, persevering and moving on through life. So Piers talked about how for his generation, they embodied that a little bit more. They weren't constantly crying over everything and all of that stuff. And then the first person that Piers debated, she was talking about this as well, but she also talked about how masculinity was different in different eras, and she brought up the example of how in another time period, men writing poetry would have been seen as masculine, or they would have been in their masculine element when they were writing poetry. And I think that can be true. And what I was thinking about is how if you have something that isn't really assigned or associated with a gender yet, men can obviously participate in that thing or that behavior without having their masculinity questioned. But once that thing becomes associated with women and femininity, when men try to participate in that behavior again, that's when they get the, oh, that's gay comment, or you're gay comments, right? And so, for example, men used to wear wigs. So you see the UK law system, they have those white wigs on. Men used to wear high heels, not like super high, but like high heels. But now those things are associated with women. So if a man were to wear a wig, you would be like, hey, that's feminine. What are you doing? Take that off. And the same thing with heels, right? And so I do find that interesting, especially when they were talking about how masculinity is different in different time periods, but it's also different regionally, and it's also different racially. So when black men are in their masculine energy, that looks very different from how white men are masculine, and then also Asian men. And so I think that there is some overlap, especially when you have what I would say white men or Asian men acting more street or urban, and they embody those masculine traits that black men normally display. I do find that interesting as well. And I also want to point out that masculinity, because it looks different across different races, different regions, and also different time periods. I wonder what we would say from a different time period is the most masculine in terms of masculine energy. And so I could go on and on about this because I was really thinking about this a lot, and it was confusing me at one point because I was like, how would you define masculine or what it means to be masculine? I know that there's going to be some things that are consistent across races and time periods, but I can't actually label those, but I know it when I see it, if that makes sense, because there is unmistakable masculine energy that you can't deny. And so anyway, getting back to the point, I don't agree that toxic masculinity is a thing. I think you just have people who behave poorly. And then we also had Parker and Piers debating, and they've interacted before, but Piers was kind of trying to figure out where he knew Parker from, and then he was very quick to point out like, hey, Parker, I'm not going to debate you, you're annoying, and all of that stuff. And obviously I think it's a little bit of a good-natured joking around and all of that stuff, because Parker talks very fast, he's throwing out all of these ideas at you and all of that stuff, right? And so he's definitely someone who would be frustrating debating, because you have to constantly keep up with what he's saying and what he's throwing at you, right? And so anyway, what was really funny about this moment is Parker was talking about how some guy was calling him gay theist. He didn't like that. And then I guess he clarified, hey, I'm not gay. And then Parker was like, oh, you're straight, right? And then it was just really funny because Piers said that as if he thought he was gay, and if he's gay or not, that doesn't matter, but it was just funny how Piers just kind of blurted that out without really thinking about what he was saying, and so the rest of us caught what he was saying. And so I'm not sure how Parker received that, but again, it doesn't really matter if he's gay or not, it was just a funny moment. And then they were also talking about the idea of going to therapy, men crying to release their emotion, and I can't remember exactly what Parker was saying, but basically he was talking about crying, and then Piers described a scene from Rocky, how he was trying to toughen up his son, and then he was talking about crying, and then Parker interjected and was like, hey, why are you talking about crying so much? And then Piers is like, well, you're the one who brought up crying, I'm just giving you an example of it or whatever, right? And so that was a funny moment as well, just to see them really kind of going back and forth, not just Piers and Parker, but him and the other contestants, because Piers would talk a lot and he would go off and talk about these examples that didn't really kind of connect back to what he was arguing, but if you let him continue, you would have eventually gotten there. And so there were a lot of times where he was just talking, he would interrupt the other people, but then didn't want them to interrupt him, and then he was like, well, hang on there a minute or whatever, right? And so it was just really funny, but I do think overall good debate. And so I want to go into the second claim. So the second claim is woke ideology is anti-liberal and faster. So what Piers was saying about liberalism is that is basically being open-minded to different ideas and people who think differently from you. And so he was saying when you're woke, you're not necessarily open to people who are different from you. You're trying to force other people to adopt your views, or they get punished basically if they don't see things how you see it. And then interestingly, one person was saying that wokeism is basically a way of distracting from the real issues, and I found that interesting because they kept talking about how there's some issues that people care about, but they're not actually important or relevant. And the trans and sports issue kept coming up, and that was super frustrating for me because, again, I did play basketball, and I can't imagine if I'm playing a sport and I lose my career opportunities, I lose my financial opportunities because a guy is better than me in my sport, but not in his sport when he's playing against other men. And so I don't think a lot of people understand that sports is a very lucrative career opportunity. If you're not athletic or you're not into sports, you don't really understand that. But when that is what your career is, that's what you want for yourself. And then that gets taken away, not because you didn't prepare or you didn't train well, but because somebody else who is more genetically talented than you, because they're a man, that really does seem unfair. And so Piers at one point was talking about, well, how would you feel if this happened to your 13-year-old daughter? And obviously you have to give people examples like that because they're not going to think about it unless it actually happens to you. I would be very interested to know if people think differently about this issue when they know someone who is directly impacted by it. Anyway, getting back to wokeism. So I really like that Piers explained like where woke came from. He said that it was associated with black music, social and racial injustice, and then that's really changed over the years. And so I think everything is woke now to the point where there's always some social or racial injustice that needs to be fought against or needs to be advocated for. And that's why it seems like it's just too much at this point, because you're constantly arguing about something, trying to fix something, trying to better something, and it just seems like you can't do it all, right? And so I do understand, yes, you want to focus on some issues, but you also have to let people dictate what issues are important to them. You can't just dismiss what other people think is important because it's not important to you. And Piers did call out one guy on that, and he was like, how arrogant of you to think that you know what should be relevant to other people and what should be more important to other people, because again, if you don't care about sports, you don't care about sports, but you also are missing out on why it's significant to other people when you're dealing with the trans and sports issue. And so we don't have to spend too much time on that. Now, where I would push back is that Piers was saying that masks were woke, and I did not agree with that, because the opposite is what I would say is true. So he was basically talking about the pandemic and COVID and how everybody had to wear masks. That was the standard. If you were woke in that time period, I would say that to be woke is to not wear a mask, to understand, hey, we don't have all of the information here, or we're going against the grind. We're aware that this is not actually socially just. We're going to push back on this and not wear a mask. That's when I would have said you were woke. You're not woke for wearing a mask. You're woke for refusing to wear a mask, right? Because you understand the deeper layer of what's going on here and what's being kind of forced on other people, right? And so that's what I would argue to that example that Piers gave of masks. And then the other thing they talked about was the idea of free speech, and they were talking about Charlie Kirk and his campus debates, and they were saying that, or the one girl was saying that Charlie Kirk didn't really advocate for free speech because he was debating college kids, so people who were younger than him, and then he was often debating people who were unprepared. And so if you know that Charlie Kirk is coming to your event and you want to debate him, it's not his responsibility to prepare you for that. Free speech isn't about being prepared. It's about what you do with your opportunity when you get to speak or to voice your opinions. Either you're prepared or you're not, and that's on you, right? And so free speech is about giving people the opportunity to say whatever they want without any repercussions to where you punish them, whether it's legally or socially, right? And so obviously Charlie Kirk at his events, he's not socially punishing people by preventing them from speaking. There is an exception, and there is a difference when you have people who are intentionally just there to troll you and they're not actually trying to have a debate, they're just trying to one-up you. That's not productive for anybody, and that's going to be super annoying, because I think the girl brought up him not wanting to debate Dean Withers or something like that, and I've seen them have a conversation because I think they debated during the Jubilee episode, and that conversation was annoying. It's just like the conversations with Parker, they're annoying because they're not really getting anywhere, right? And so obviously you don't want that in your event because it hijacks the moment. It makes it more about this nonsense conversation that you guys are having instead of giving other people the opportunity to embrace and practice their free speech and have a conversation with Charlie Kirk. And so I would push back that free speech is not necessarily about whether or not you're prepared. It's just about whether or not you had the opportunity to speak about something at all. And Charlie Kirk was giving people that opportunity. And lastly, the third claim, gender neutral pronouns are pointless. So I found this super interesting because obviously you do need gendered pronouns. You need to know who a man is and refer to him in those terms. So he, his, him, all of that stuff. And the funniest moment during this conversation was the guy who was an actual therapist, and he was basically, you need to call people how they want to be called. You need to address them by the right pronouns and all of that stuff. And so I think he listed 6 of the pronouns, and then he was like Z or something like that. And so Piers was like, okay, what's Z? And he didn't know what it was. And that was so funny because obviously you're talking about using these pronouns, using them correctly as a sign of respect, but you also don't know what you're saying. So obviously you're just saying it, and there's kind of like an empty meaning behind it, right? Because you don't really understand what you're saying in the first place, right? And so I did find that interesting. And then interestingly, that same girl, she was basically talking about how in some languages they don't have gendered pronouns, which I found super interesting. So you would basically say, instead instead of saying she is, you would say Stacy is, or instead of saying he is dumb, you would say Blake is dumb, right? So you would just use their name in place of their pronoun. And I think it was, I can't remember his name, but one of the guys, he brought up how, like, if you don't want to use their pronoun, just use their name, and you get around that situation of saying or having to say pronouns that you don't want to say, especially if you feel like that's not the right pronoun for that person, whatever, just use their name, right? And so the lady was talking about how some languages don't have pronouns, but I'm sure they still have an idea of what a man and a woman is, right? Even though they're using your name and not your pronoun, they can still tell whether or not you're a man or a woman, because it's man and woman that literally determine your gender. It's not he or she, right? So anyway, that probably sounds really weird, but I thought that was an interesting point, because even if you don't have the words for it, you can still tell what a man is and what a woman is. And then this leads me into the girl saying that basically Piers was talking about how he was on a show and he was talking to two people and he kept saying, the wokies and whatever, right? And so he was talking to one woman and he's like, hey, I want to identify as a black lesbian. And then he was saying that the other woman who was there started laughing because she understood what he was doing. And that is the thing that people do. They'll say something ridiculous that you're not that thing, right? You're a white man, you're not a black lesbian. And so anyway, what he was trying to point out is that he can't say he's a black lesbian because there are limits to what you can identify as. The girl he was talking to was saying, you can't say that you're a black lesbian as a white man because there's a biological reality. And it's interesting that she was able to say that because obviously she's speaking to his race. He, as a white man, can't identify as a black man, right? Because he is white. His skin is literally a different color than a black man's, right? And so she's talking about these biological realities, but at the same time, we're ignoring the biological realities of sex because we've created this term called gender. And so I think literally having gender as this other thing that's not necessarily attached to the private parts that you have, I think that's just super confusing, because again, you can have men who are more masculine, you can have men who are more feminine, and the same thing could be true for women. But I think when you add gender into that just complicates things, because again, what they'll say first, there's some women who act more masculine or they are tomboys, but they're not necessarily gay, right? They just have a different energy about them, right? And so I just find that interesting that we can more clearly say, hey, you as a white man, you're not black, but we can say, well, you as a white man, you can be a white girl, right? And so that's just super interesting when you think about it that way. And that's probably a better example, because you'll bat your eye at him saying as a white man that he is a black lesbian, but you'll be fine if he says, hey, I'm a white girl, right? Because so that's just really interesting. But yeah, overall, I thought that this was a pretty good debate. It was super entertaining. And I do like these Jubilee debates because you really get to hear different perspectives. You get to hear the claims and what people are arguing and what the pushback is. And this is no different from Charlie Kirk's campus tours. Obviously, that these are recorded. That this is going to go viral. And it's really on you to be prepared, especially if you're auditioning for this or whatever, right? You're being cast for this. It's on you to be prepared, right? And so for the girl who was saying that what Charlie Kirk was doing, it was so funny because she was like, I'm trying to replicate what he was doing. Like, you're criticizing it, but then you're trying to replicate it because you understand that it works, right? And so I just find that interesting, because would you say the same thing about the Jubilee debate? Would you say that Piers is debating somebody who's unprepared when you at the same time know that you audition for this, you put yourself in that position, right? And so I think accountability goes both ways. It's on both people to show up prepared to debate whoever and whatever comes their way. And so that is a pretty interesting thing to think about. Alrighty, so let me know what your thoughts are on this Jubilee episode. Did you agree with any of the claims? Are there any areas where you would push back? Let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.